Welcome to another episode of If It's in the Mind, It Can Be Managed, the podcast where we're talking about as much as we can about emotional health, mindset, giving people the tools and the successes that they need to get from where they are to where they want to be. And we in all these podcasts, we get some amazing guests on that talk about their experiences of how they've overcome many challenges. Now, Mike, I was introduced to you by my previous guest and said, "Oh, you've got to speak to Mike. Mike's got some amazing stories." So introduce yourself, Mike. Tell us who you are, what you do, and then we'll move from there.
Hi, I'm Mike Stevenson. Delighted to be here. Um, I now speak.
Yes.
I speak to corporate audiences, I speak at conferences, and I speak to people basically because they all share one thing that I do believe that people are not fully aware of the talents and the skills and the capabilities they've got. And, particularly now in the workplace, there's quite a big disconnection between employees and the vision of the company. We've got a low productivity problem in this country, which is it does pose problems, but it poses problems for employees as well as it does for employers because, I've worked in places where I it was a wonder I moved a finger because of the way I was treated. I've worked in places where I didn't know what the company produced. Didn't think of I was in the steelworks in Sheffield in 1972, and I joined this belt, and it was extraordinary. This big bit of steel, it was partly shapen, and I took it in tongs and I put it under the die and stamped it down, and then moved it on to someone else. And I said to the foreman, "What I'm actually making?" He says, "You don't have to know that." I said, "What?" And in fact, it was camshafts for Ford Motors. But I think we've got a leadership problem in this country, and the tendency is to blame the people that are being led or not being led. So I think a lot of the disconnection we're seeing at work is the result of leadership. And, compared with other countries, we do pretty badly. And, I don't know where it comes from. I think we've got quite a managerial culture. And what happens is, people are promoted into leadership because they're good at the job they do.
Yeah.
So you get someone who's brilliant at a job and they get promoted into leadership, and the productivity of the place they used to work goes down because they've been removed from that, and they're not leadership material and they don't want to be leaders, but it's the only way they can make more money. So there is a structural and a leadership problem. But employees can do a lot. And I think that is what I focus on because if leadership isn't there, you want employees to take leadership themselves. And often we hold back from that. So I'm a great believer in, encouraging people to be leaders in their own lives and in the workplace as well. And we do have a kind of fatalistic culture in this country where we believe that our standing is kind of predestined, that our futures are cast in stone. And, that's related to the class system and the way that, there's always been an assumption that we have a ruling class, which we've had. I don't believe that going to a good public school entitles you to lead the country. And I think we've seen examples of how that has been catastrophically wrong in recent years. So we've got a leadership problem. And it means that at times like these, the workers have been blamed for, productivity, for a lack of enthusiasm about employment, taking time off, having mental health problems. And we keep hearing this. We keep hearing that, that businesses are being taken a loan of by their employees. That's a Scottish expression. And
Well,
it's profoundly wrong,
I,
profoundly wrong.
do you know what? I completely agree with that. And when you're talking about that, there was something that always rings a bell from me, and it was always something that was very, very true that people don't leave companies, they leave bad management.
Yes,
It's always there, and I think the managers get a hard time. So I worked at Royal Caribbean, and I was staff manager, then director. And I will always be very open and honest. I got promoted because I had the personality, I had the workness. I went out and proved and made sure that I was doing everything. And then when I got into management, I was like, oh, what am I supposed to do? I was an atrocious manager. And I had people come out and train me at Royal Caribbean. This is what you need to do to manage, Cuddy. This is what you need to do to manage. So I have been absolutely blessed with some of the best managers, leaders, and captains of industry who've
Yeah.
shown me how to lead, coach, and manage people. And yes, that is missing within businesses. Managers, we people get promoted so quickly because they were good, they were productive. So the leadership and the up aboves think, oh well, he'll be able to pass that on to everybody else. But people understand, and you're absolutely right. It's that we're talking
Yeah.
growth mindset and fixed mindset. There's a fixed mindset that we can't learn, we can't grow, and we can't develop. And that mindset gets stuck for a lot of young people. And you mentioned something
Does. Yeah.
before. One of the most powerful things that I thought you mentioned, I'd love to touch on that again, is we live in a future phobic era at this moment in time. We're so scared about the future. So touch on that more.
Well, I read a lot of research material, which often doesn't see the light of day because it's always badly presented, because they tend to be academic papers. And anyway, I read that this young generation today is the most future phobic and pessimistic in history, and well, in recorded history. And I can believe that
Yes.
because we've got an environment just now which is, we've got wars raging. How do young people make any kind of moral sense about what's happening when they hear people defending some of the worst atrocities we've ever seen, defending it? And if you're young and you watch that, what can you believe? What do you believe when you realize that you're probably going to be, particularly for young men just now,
Yeah.
you've got a future which is very, very difficult to contemplate. We don't have wars going on. Young men used to be produced for war, let's be honest. I think it was Winston Churchill said a leader's or a national leader's job is to send young men to war to be killed. You know, what's an appalling thought. And now, of course, the gender balance has changed, which is brilliant because, we see amazing women doing extraordinary things. But I think one of the casualties, and it's an unintended consequence, is that young men who already fall behind at school, who always did fall behind at school, are falling behind even further. Girls are maturing faster. And a lot of the jobs available now, because we're in a kind of post-industrial age, are really about communication. And boys will never be as good communicators as girls are. It's just, the way we are, we're more visual, we're more practical. And it is leaving a generation behind. And I was talking to a group of young lads the other night who are in and out of trouble. And I spoke to them about my own background, and it really resonated with them that, they have got their destiny in their own hands, and that they have to take steps, they have to do things, they have to galvanize themselves, not to stay in that state where their future is at best uncertain, at worst set in stone, and without hope and possibility.
I think one of the things that we touched on before and we'll definitely touch now is when you are talking from a place of experience, talk about let's deep dive Mike Stevenson. Let's go through what Mike Stevenson's had to go through so that which is why you can talk as such as an authority for how to become more resilient, to be able to overcome those challenges. So let's go back to young Mike Stevenson. Let's talk about that. Mike, tell me about your, he says with a smile, but tell me about your childhood and your growing up and your experiences that will help.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, my parents, my father was Scottish Irish, my mother was Lebanese, who was brought up in Egypt, and they met in Egypt just at the tail end of the war. No, it was earlier than that actually. My father wanted to do some civilian work in Egypt, and he ended up doing some English teaching there to locals. And he was at some event and he met my mother, who had to be chaperoned everywhere. And they got married and they came back here. And I was one of four. I was the second born. And, it was, I think I was caught in the kind of crosshairs of my mother's anxieties about being in a strange country with her father. Just died before I was born. In fact, he died. No, just after I was born. He died with the telegram announcing my birth on his chest. And she must have gone through pretty hellish times. Anyway, we moved to Kirkcaldy, and having traveled around the world, we've been to Pakistan and Egypt and Italy, because the ship, because people traveled in ships then. So we traveled in a big ocean liner down to ended up Lahore, and came back 3 years later because my I'd suffered from paratyphoid and my asthma was really bad at that time. So we came back primarily because of my health. And so we arrived in Kirkcaldy at the age of 10, and I hated school. Every minute of school. I hated it with a passion. And the teachers always seemed to highlight me. Maybe it's because my disinterest was so palpable to any teacher that they really took badly to it. But to me, teachers sounded like system drones. I've been diagnosed with ADHD only about 9 months ago, actually,
Yeah.
and maybe that played a part. But I hated it. I hated sitting in classrooms, and I couldn't listen to the teachers. I was just so distracted. In secondary school, my mind was on the Beatles, the Stones, the music, the excitement, the revolution that young people were going through, developing their own kind of image and philosophies. So I was chucked out at 15. And at the same time, my parents were going through a pretty bad separation, and they ultimately divorced. At that time, very few people divorced. Um, so, and it was quite well known in Kirkcaldy because my father had had an affair with a younger woman,
Right.
and so I was also being chased because I'd gone out with this girl whose boyfriend was on the fishing boats, and I was told that when he came back he would kill me, not by his girlfriend. She never told me about him, but and I was getting attacked a lot on the streets at that time. So I escaped down to London and actually got a job. You know what? I was 16, and I got a job. And by the way, I've been singing in a rock band in Kirkcaldy, for the 2 years before I went down to London. And so I'd found something in myself that had been completely absent. It was being on stage I loved, and I could take a microphone and I could sing and I could perform. And we had a bit of backing at that time. It wasn't just church hall. We did some gigs around Fife. And so anyway, I arrived in London and I had dreams of becoming a rock star, obviously.
Obviously.
Yeah, of course. And I got a job in a shop, and I was sacked 3 weeks later because none of the customers could understand my Fife accent at the time. So I went back to my landlady and I said, I've just lost my job because they can't understand a word I said. And she said, well, if you've lost your job, you've also lost your accommodation. So please pack up and leave. So I ended up out in the streets for many, many months. And that was tough. I mean, I was very young and I had a lot of adventures. Boy, did I have adventures, some of which I can't even begin to talk about or even recall. But I got thrown down the stairs when I was sleeping, which is something quite extraordinary. You imagine waking up with your head on the fifth step going down the steps. And I used to get kicked awake by the Met sometimes. But you learn to be resourceful. And as I became more and more resourceful, um, I was faced with this choice. I'm either just going to die on the streets, because lots of people I knew did. They did die on the streets, hypothermia, drugs. I was on drugs. It was the only way of surviving. And, uh, and I had this conversation with a guy in a toilet who had knocked on my closet door, because this was Piccadilly Circus and they had toilets that were open all night. So I found a closet one night and sat down there hoping to get a better night's sleep. And he knocked on the door, and he was an old man. He spoke with this incredibly posh accent. He had this received pronunciation. He knocked on the door and says, "Excuse me, have you got a room for one tonight?" So I let him in, and he looked like the archetypical vagrant with a rope tied round his waist. And he told me the story, and it very, very quickly. He'd been very wealthy. He'd lived in somewhere near Stanmore in Middlesex, and he'd been in business for quite a long time. And he told me how he spent far less time at home than he would have liked to, looking back, because he loved his wife and his 4-year-old daughter. And he would overcompensate. So one day he arrived back with a sports car, and he rang the doorbell, and his wife came out. He says, "Darling, this is for your birthday." And there was this red sports car. And he says, "Look, take yourself and the little one out for a wee drive. Try the car out. And when you come back, I've got another gift for you. I'm sure you'll love." So they went off, and basically they never returned. They hit a tree, and their lives were taken. And his response was, "All I've ever really loved and wanted has left me." So he basically threw away the keys of his house and he left. And he'd been wandering around the streets for 7 years. And he was happy that he'd made the right decision. And he said to me, "Whatever you do, money is a consequence of what you do, never a name in itself." And that really stuck with me. And I wish he was around today to tell that story, because we've seen a period of unprecedented greed. And anyway, he said, "Look, you're a fantastic young man. What is it you want to do?" And I said, "I want to be myself. I want to be the creative person I think I am." I played the guitar. I used to sing in a band. I loved all of that. And he was very encouraging. And then I got arrested one night, and it was the police who said to me, like, "Before you leave this station, tell us your dreams." I thought, wow, that's a policeman asking me this question. Where's the catch? Anyway, I said, "Look, I want to do well in my music, and one day I want to set up my own business." And he said, "Go off and do that, starting from now." And so the police helped me. And I think sometimes we underestimate the power of the police to make a positive difference to young lives. And I've seen it with the Violence Reduction Unit in Glasgow, an amazing organisation where you see, people who are destined for a life in prison, their lives being retrieved, and then them going on and doing extraordinary things. And I've met a few of them. I've shared a stage with some of them. So that was a really defining thing for me. That I happened to meet an Irishman who said, I hear you play the guitar." And I said, "Yeah, yeah. Well, I haven't for a long time, because I've been here for, it's now 16 months. And he said, "Look, why don't you come to Dublin with me and you can busk there?" So I did. And I borrowed a guitar from someone in Dublin, and I stood at the top of Grafton Street and started belting out these songs to be introduced to a Lebanese bongo player. There's an amazing kind of synchronicity. And he sat behind me, and we sang these songs, and we became sort of cause celebs in Dublin, because I was the first guitarist to busk in Dublin. This is in 1968, and it was brilliant. I mean, really extraordinary. met so many people, got invited to parties, um, and met two guys who came and said, that was really cool. And it was Phil Lynott and Brian Downey from Thin Lizzy. They were just starting out in a new band. And just to follow that up, years later, I was back in Piccadilly Circus in the early 70s, and I heard my name being called, and it was them. And they got into the top 10. That was them telling me that Whiskey in the Jar was racing out the charts. It was extraordinary. But, then I went back to London, and did lots of jobs. I worked in construction, worked in, catering, in wine bottling and packing, all sorts of jobs. And the first instance I got of feeling valued at work was when I joined this construction site in Earl's Court. And it was a big Welsh foreman with a soft hat and a broken nose. And he put his arm around me when I arrived and he says, Michael, welcome. He says, before you start, I want to show you something. And he took me to this hut and he showed me the drawing. He says, this is the palace you're building. Come in here and remind yourself every day you're building a palace. And I felt this extraordinary surge of energy. And I worked so hard for this guy. And everyone else did as well. And I thought, this is leadership. Everywhere else had been about tasks. Here was someone, saying you are very much an architect. Well, not an architect, but a builder of something that's going to be rise into London skyline, and you're going to leave a legacy on this city. And after sleeping out in it for so long, I thought this was incredible. So I learned a lot from this guy about leadership, about motivation, and then of course I went on to other jobs, and uh, it wasn't there. It just wasn't there. I got the sack from job after job after job for talking back or coming up with ideas. And, I met leaders, well, managers who resented the fact that the customers liked me. I mean, it was just extraordinary. I got the sack from one job because some girls came around to meet me at the door of this place I was working, and he said, right, go on, take them upstairs and I'll join you in 5 minutes. I said, no. I got the sack for insubordination. I mean, I had so many poor experiences. So, I got a lot of my knowledge and my experience and what I talk about, the lessons I've learned from that period. But of course, I went from that, and I did kind of recover, and I started learning, and I went to study at college, and I realized I liked learning because the college I was at was one where people who had failed in education, it's funded by the Scottish Education Department, the trade union movement at the time, and you went in to learn because you were discussing things in the class. You weren't just being presented a kind of onslaught of information, which the way I've learned to speak is precisely not to do that. It's not to deal with data and facts. It is to do with connecting with people emotionally and making them feel they're part of your journey. It's about storytelling. It's about understanding where people are. It's about starting where they are. It's about putting your audience center stage, not myself.
Yeah.
Uh, and you learn that through experience. And if I hadn't been through all these experiences, I would not have learned that. But I do go back to the classroom where I could not stand it. And you remember at that time, maybe you don't remember, but the teacher spent half the class with his back to you.
Yeah.
You think of that, with a chalk on the board. And of course, I didn't know it then. I was short-sighted, so I couldn't see the blackboard apart from anything else. And I was hopeless. And I remember one interaction, one question I did answer quite gladly. He said, oh, I want to ask, this is the end of term, and I want to go around the class and just ask you, you know, a poet you like and why. So I went around and people were saying John Keats, Louis MacNeice, Chaucer. Someone said Chaucer,
Mm.
um, crawler. And anyway,
Uh,
it came to me and I said, Bob Dylan. He said, oh, God, please. Bob Dylan, I think he's what you call a singer-songwriter, eh? This is a serious lesson. And anyway, I think he'd be dead now, but I wish he'd been around to see Bob Dylan winning the Nobel Prize for Literature just a few years ago.
yeah.
That was the kind of interaction I had at school. I am sure some teachers were more enlightened than that, but not that one. And I just thought, this is ludicrous. Um, Absolutely ludicrous. I was telling this story the other day, actually. My sister lived in Nigeria with her husband for a few years, and they had four boys. And the boys were obviously, young, but they came back to Edinburgh after, a number of years of living abroad. And the one of the sons went to the local primary school, and the teacher asked, "So tell me, what did you do in your summer holidays? I want you to write this down, a little story about what you did." And of course, my nephew wrote, "I saw a public execution during my holidays, and and then I saw someone drowned." And it was just an innocent recollection of where he was in the summer. Of course, he got called a liar, and you shouldn't lie in the classroom. That's a terrible thing to do. It's a really irresponsible thing to do. You're upsetting people here. So he went and told my sister, and went racing up to the school and pulled his teacher up and says, "Actually, we were in Nigeria, and that is exactly what happened. I didn't want him to see that. He and his brother just wandered up the road, and there was a public execution." But it just brought into play one of the things I think I suffered from, which was, I'd been in Egypt, I'd been in Pakistan. So when they talked about the ancient Egyptians, I said, I've been in Egypt, and they hated that, really hated it. You could have an experience that might bring something to the classroom. I'd seen the pyramids, uh, but there was this terrible disconnect. So when I started doing what I do now, and I have worked with a lot of young people, I worked with a gang in Edinburgh for a while, and I see extraordinary young things in these young people
Hmm.
that they don't see in themselves. And if they don't get a chance to realize their enormous capabilities, then they're likely to end up in a cycle of prison, out, in, out, in, a cycle that, if it's not arrested, if you excuse a terrible pun, will lead to terrible consequences in the long term. And I've seen so many coming out of prison. The only place they know is to go back to where they came from. So they go back to the same, people and the same temptations. And it's a terrible cycle. And what a waste of humanity. And that is the thing that I find the most utterly incomprehensible in our society, is that so many young people, and I'm talking boys and girls, will not get a chance because of the postcode, because of the poverty of their parents, because of the environment in which they live, and that they are kind of predestined. And when they say that, they're usually right, because there's nothing there to, and we talk about a growing welfare cost. And the utter stupidity of never having realized that without those interventions, without those people that can stop this, continuous self-belief, this self-doubt, the lack of roots out, the lack of belief, the periphery from where the jobs market is, all of that sort of thing. It is utter stupidity that we've not changed that. And I say it's stupidity because I have had a lot of solutions over the years, and they've never been listened to. And sometimes they're very simple.
Yeah.
You know, I was one of the founder members of an organization called Heatwise Glasgow. That was back in 1984. And, we took on long-term unemployed people, put them through an interview, and gave them really good work experience, and they got a wage. So it was very different from the kind of, tiny little purse to take home. They got a proper job, a proper grounding, proper training. And I was on the marketing side of it. So, I was bringing people in who had no previous experience. And I would say to them, for example, at an interview, and I remember this particular guy pretty well, I said, you were taught about, the kind of interview questions to ask. And I quickly abandoned them and I changed to something else. But you were meant to say, tell me what your strengths are. And this guy said, I've not got any, mister. I said, surely. And I thought, no, he's not going to tell me. I says, okay, no, I understand. So tell me what you do. What did you do on Saturday, Sunday, this weekend? What did you get up to? And he said, well, on the Saturday morning, there's an old woman that lives up the road. She used to look out for me when I was a kid. And I go and buy a shop and I come back, we have a wee cup of tea. And then Saturday night, I'm just kind of in the house. And then Sunday, there's a bunch of kids play football up the road. I go and help them a wee bit, to develop the skills and the confidence. And this is the guy who said he had no strengths.
Yeah.
So I feed back to him, I says, listen, those are enormous strengths.
Yeah.
And he says, do you think so? And anyway, I met some remarkable, who went on to do extraordinary things, and I connected with them. And I think they saw me as probably not the best leader, or maybe a rotten manager, but a good leader, but a very good facilitator of their learning
Yeah.
and their ambitions. And that all came from where I'd been.
Yeah.
And then, we've got remarkable people whose talents will never see the light of day.
So, Mike, it kind of sounds like when you talk on a fascinating story of all the trials and tribulations you've had, especially from childhood. And for anyone that's listening, and this is what I work with when I'm working with clients and things like that, is we're constantly making a meaning, we're constantly making a story about everything how we've been made to feel. So it kind of sounds like from as a child, you weren't engrossed in learning, you were always thinking about other things.
Yep.
You had a lack of empathy for, not a lack of empathy, but a lack of understanding of why people wouldn't want to listen to somebody who said, oh, I've been to Egypt. So as a child, we start creating that concept of not being heard, not being good enough, not being listened to. And that moves forward into people's lives, and people are still living with those beliefs from childhood. A lot of the clients I work with, we deal with the childhood so that they can move forward, that inner childhood in our people with everyone. So how do you do that? And what's some of the three things that Mike does when he's out talking, an inspirational speaker, motivational speaker, that helps connect to young people so that when they watch this or anybody else is watching this, what's the three things you do to connect to that young team, young people, to let them know they have more skills than they could ever imagine?
Well, I'll give you an example. I was asked to go and speak, and it was the hall at St John's Church at the West End of Edinburgh,
Yeah.
and I'd forgotten about it. And when I realised, I thought, God, and I ran down the road. I got a taxi, and I arrived there, and the first speaker was already up. And there were young people who got into a bit of trouble. They were not in the best condition, and some of them were sleeping out. And when I stood up and I said, oh, I can see it in your eyes. I know exactly what's going on. You've heard all the things that you can't do. People have been telling you what you can't do, what you can't do, what you shouldn't do, what you'll never be able to do. They've told you how useless you are. And by the way, someone else will tell you these are the best days of your life. They're not. The best days of your life start today. Your best is yet to come. Anyway, I went through and I talked a bit about my journey and how I'd been told you'll never amount to anything, all of that stuff. And this girl, 15-year-old, sent a yellow sticky up to the front and it said, Mike Stevenson, you've just changed my life. So I think that the trick there is to get into where they're at. So you show you understand it. It is not a kind of generalist thing. It's not a generalist thing. It's not just, you're better than you think you are, because that will not mean anything to anyone.
Hmm.
It's saying, you know, I see it in your eyes. You guys have got something extraordinary, but you've been told all the things you can't do. You've been made to feel useless. You've had people telling you things that have upset you all your life. You've shut down. No one listens to you. Just what you've been saying, and they're all going, yes, yes. And when you've got an audience that's saying yes, yes, it's like the first time anyone's ever registered that thought with them.
Yeah.
Anyone's ever thought, you know, you've got the whole world ahead of you. The world is your oyster. And they sit and they listen to that shit, quite honestly. Because unless you understand where they're at, and they do not think the world is their oyster, they think the world is against them. They've been beaten. They've been, you know, bullied by parents. They've probably been bullied at school. They've probably got into all kinds of scrapes. They've got into trouble, and they're marked out by people as being, difficult. Uh, and the local authority might call them hard to reach communities. There's no such thing as a hard to reach community.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of thing. We I've got this thing about policy speak, right? We talk about hard to reach communities, which actually means we have not reached them. We've never tried to reach them because we use the same normal means of communication with people who have got all kinds of barriers up for very good reasons. I remember this little boy at school in Edinburgh saying to me, he says, I can't do that. I'm socially excluded. And I said,
The labels.
yeah, it was just that around the area, they're all social inclusion strategy. We're a social inclusion employer. And the language filters through. I asked second-year-old boys, second-year secondary boys in East Lothian, where I was doing work for the council, about how they could communicate with people and develop this strategy of proper communication. And I held up the council logo, and this boy said, I said, what does that mean to you? And he says, no ball games, mister.
Ha
I told a story to in Edinburgh, and there were councillors there, and they says, we'll remove them as from tomorrow, because they've never seen from this other perspective. But you go around and everything's telling you what you can't do. And the signage in poor areas is very different from the signage uptown. I remember in West Hills, someone saying you go uptown, you get Black Hearts Rum, Black Hearts Rum adverts, with a sexy woman with a tattoo on her breast. And up here, it's all, welfare, social inclusion stuff,
Yeah.
benefits, advisors, housing office. There's nothing here that would tell you that you belong to a world that exists outside this estate.
Yeah.
So, we've created this.
Yeah.
And I think it's inexcusable that we have not found it. No government has found a way to connect those people, from a young age, and their parents, because you can't just work with the kids. You got to work with the parents as well.
Yeah. Absolutely. You've shared so many highlights and so many stories and so many simplicities of life, Mike, that I'm always talking about when I do my public speaking, when I'm out coaching and talking to the kids and things like that.
Yeah.
And I'll share a story because it's very much, if I didn't know the power of language and the power of communication, which is what the news is and media like that. And I'm not attacking the news, I'm not attacking social media, but I remember through COVID, the only thing that happened when the news was on, the government would come on and say, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this. There was never at any one point, that's what the government had to do, Mike. You'll agree with that. That's what the government had to do. Unfortunately, now, because we're not aware, we can't do this, we can't do this, we can't do this. So I fully understand the power of language, the power of the brain, the power of the mind. If you're listening to that, you will 100% have anxiety, stress, depression.
Yep.
Because not never at one point did any of the government or the politicians say, but you can do this, but you can do this, and you can do this. So somebody asked me a long time ago when I didn't struggle through. I actually technically changed career, moved from working. Didn't lose the job, but I didn't go back to working at Royal Caribbean because I'd had 18 months away, and I thought I don't really want to go back. I want to do something different, something more purposeful. And somebody said, why is it you didn't struggle through lockdown? I went, because I understand that even though I've been told you can't do this, can't do this, I had to go and ask, what can I do? So I found out I can walk on my own. I could go for bike rides on my own, and I could start cold water therapy. There was nothing that no one said you can't go and get in cold water. And that's the three things that I started doing because I had to understand the power of other people's language and expectations and rules without breaking them don't have to apply. They have to pass on information, but they never, like you said, Mike, they never come in with, but you can do this, you can do
Yeah.
this, and you can do this. Because
Yeah.
they never have the other part of the competition, the communication. The communication is you might not be good at that. That's not your forte. But start looking at these kind of things, and that's the power of communication. That's something that you're very good at, Mike, if you don't mind my saying.
Well, you learn it. So I mean, I had a creative agency for 20 years until the banking crisis came along, and Peter along just wasn't going to survive. So it was all about communication. And I remember I would do, I would get my inspiration from the people, right? So it was the employees in the company, the customers. And I remember two things I'll tell you very briefly. We did a foster campaign for the City of Edinburgh Council, and they were very enthused by the fact that I wanted to speak to foster carers first. I want to get them in a room. So we got in a room in the city chambers. It was all very grand, sitting around this large table. And I was asking them about what foster carers caring meant to them. And they were coming out with these things like, I get to go to gigs. You know, I get to take someone to the football on a Saturday to see the Hibs. That's not a claim which I would boast about right at this minute. Because I'm Hibs supporter. You did the work for Hibs as well, so I can say that with some um, tongue in cheek. But I suddenly got this joy of foster caring, rather than pictures of forlorn children looking through bars and windows. And I thought, what if we do a campaign? And we did it in an illustrative style, right? So we got a friend of mine in Fife actually lives in Kingon. He did these illustrations of, parents gaming with their kids and standing at a gig, all of that stuff with a kid beside them, going to the football, all of these things. And we increased the foster care inquiries by 40%
Mhm.
in 6 months. That was the power of it. But I also asked them, what voice would you? The other thing that people said, the foster care, when you phone up the line, you get this answering machine. Often the tape misplayed and the voice was kind of like you for phoning the phone up Monday or something like that. I can't remember. And they said, oh, it'd be someone like Lorraine Kelly. So request to ITB Studios. Yes, of course I'll do it. Of course I'll do it, but don't tell. I'll just make the tape for you. And she sent a tape up, right? She
Yeah.
said, any money you want to give to charity, that's fine. So her voice appeared as the voice of the foster care line. And the other thing is don't tell people that you'll hear from us because people are getting their lives looked at during this process.
Yeah.
We produced a card that said, this is the journey you'll be on, and it gave a sort of timeline. And people like that. It gave them certainty. And if you haven't heard from us with this date, phone up. Doesn't mean anything's wrong. We're working on your behalf. We want to get this sorted out for you. So simple. I was in Easterhouse, South Easterhouse, and I had this room full of people. See, you can tell I love doing this, right?
Yeah.
This was part of the research for doing some work for that community as they were transferring from council housing to housing association housing, right? And it was about getting neighbourhood management in there, get people involved in their own house building program and their planning. And so I said, can anyone describe what it's like to live in this area in a sentence? And there was silence, and this older woman stood up and she said, well, son, see if you want a suntan, fucking brilliant place to live. See if you want to go to the bookies or a lawyer's, fucking brilliant place to live. See if you want a banana, you've got to get in a bus and go a mile down the road. So that became the symbol, the banana. It was either that way or that way. And it's those things. And it's true, they're a glistening suntan parlour because the market does respond to poverty.
It
It
does.
provides things, it says this is what you want. Of course, you want a criminal lawyer and you want a bookie shop. So you're compounding. I mean, in some of those communities, they are so resourceful. I mean, these guys, these girls are wider than the people that run the city.
Yeah.
But they've had to learn. They've had to learn it. And you see, I mean, there was looking up, this apartment looked derelict. And then you could see on the balcony they were playing with a fruit machine. They'd obviously stolen it from somewhere. And this was the local fruit machine. And it is, you've got to take some of that resourcefulness, some of that imagination, and use it because you also find great leadership in those communities.
Yeah.
And those are the people that will make the best leaders. I've always said this. You look at people like Bill Shankly, Alex Ferguson, Jock Stein, these great football managers. These guys came from, one was tool making, the others were from the pits,
Yeah.
you know, and they knew about how to get the best out of people. They knew that it was about the people. It's not about hierarchy. And Bill Shankly talks about the trinities as there's me, there's the players, and there's the supporters. It's all about them. It's all about the people, and we do the best for those people. But he said the board, they're just there to sign checks. I love that. He dissed the board completely. This is about what we do. And he was such a great manager. And he set a kind of culture down at Liverpool, which has never been totally lost, which is why they can bring in new managers. It's all part of a dynastic approach. They learn because the backroom staff, the ones that are the stable, the kind of wheels of the tricycle, they're always there. So that's leadership.
Yeah.
It's great leadership.
I think you speak so well about understanding the power of coming from a place of experience will create better leadership. I want to say a massive thank you to you, Mike, for sharing your wisdoms, sharing your stories, and to anyone who's listening this, don't ever underestimate the power of what you've learned in the hustle of life. I think people genuinely misunderstand that their hustle and their grinding, the normality of doing something that they think, oh, well, I just do that. It's like, no, 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 that's a massive skill. That's genuinely a skill that businesses need and will pay for. Don't let the opinions of others, of childhood, and other people's, most opinions come from other people's failures, traumas, and miseries. And they'll always pass on that information by saying, oh, this happened to me, so don't let it happen to you. But you're listening to somebody else's failures, but not from a successful point of view. Whereas when you talk, Mike, you're like, oh, no, this happened to me, and I made it into an absolute, and that's a powerful reframe. So thank you so much, Mike.
My pleasure.
Plenty of your time there, mate. It's been absolutely fantastic. I'm sure we'll have a bigger chat. Is there anything else you want to share, Mike, before we wrap up?
Yes, there was something about just what you've been saying. I went for a job that involved looking after people, and I had to write my CV on a foolscap piece of paper because I didn't have access to the typewriter. And I think they interviewed me as a joke because this interview panel were sitting there. They were saying, right, so you've had 26 jobs. Is that right? I said, yeah. Um, you've had the sack from one, two, three, four, five, six, seven, eight, nine, 10 of them. Yes. And then you can see them all looking at each other and say, so what are you going to bring to this job? I said, well, I may have had the sack from these jobs, but I've learned how to plaster a wall. I've learned to lay bricks. I've learned to paint and decorate. I've learned to do a bit of joinery. I've pulled people back from the brink of death because I was the only person within the vicinity to do that. I've learned how to communicate with people. I've entertained pedestrian Saturday night audiences in Dublin. I've learned a lot. And they give me the job.
There we go.
So
Not
there you
just
are.
I love it. A lost job or a multitude of skills can be learned in everything. And that's how we reframe every negative. And I'm a big believer there's no such thing as a negative. There's always a positive to a negative.
I've never taken someone on because of their qualifications. And I
Yep.
know that's a terrible thing to say, but of course you look at them. Of
Yep.
course you look at them.
Yep.
But the character, it's the color of their character that you and their attitude and their enthusiasm and their capacity to learn. That's it.
Character and attitude has got me so much further in life than any of the skills that I've had.
Yeah.
Mike, it's been an absolute pleasure. If there's ever a lesson or if it's in the mind, it can be managed. This was it. As always, big love from Cuddy. We'll see you on the next podcast. And thank you very much to today's amazing guest, the ever wonderful, extremely powerful Mike Stevenson. Thank you very much.